Are there further amendments? You want a roll call? You really want a roll call?
I think if they're going to ask roll calls, it ought to be meaner in the debate.
Okay. Other amendments to this section?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Deal.
I have an amendment at the desk, number 35.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Clerk will report the Deal amendment, and we'd like to ask that amendment be distributed.
Amendment offered by Mr. Deal. In subsection DD4 of Section 1902 of the Social Security Act, as added by Section 3003A2, strike subparagraph A and insert the following. A, individuals described...
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Deal, is recognized for 2 minutes. Mr. Deal?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I was being told that it was drafted based on the original print rather than the committee substitute, but I understand that that is acceptable and that would be a technical correction if it were adopted. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay. This is an amendment that deals with the section of the bill of people who are unemployed being able to buy into and become eligible under Medicaid. Now, this does not require any asset or income test in order to be able to do it. And the federal government, under this legislation, would be required to pay 100% of the individual's cost who are enrolled under this program. Now, I would hope that you would take the same approach with the millionaire amendment we dealt with earlier as it related to COBRA. This is a millionaire amendment as it relates to Medicaid. And it simply says that if you have income of more than $1 million, that you would not be eligible to come under a government 100% paid for federal government program providing you with Medicaid coverage. I find it somewhat ironic that the legislation does not have built into it either an asset or an income test as a qualification requirement. This would provide at least a partial cap on who would be considered eligible.
We did the $1 million.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
Has the gentleman from does the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Deal, yield back the balance of his time?
Would yield to Mr. Barton.
I have asked to put a statement in the record in support of the amendment.
Without objection, such.
I would yield back.
The chair will recognize himself in opposition to this amendment. I want to emphasize let me do this right. I want to emphasize that the economists and the nonpartisan experts from Treasury have told us it is nearly impossible to guess what newly unemployed people's income will be. The whole point of the temporary Medicaid insurance coverage option is to build on an existing program that will get temporary assistance to uninsured individuals quickly. So we want to streamline the enrollment process. $1,050,000, there's an arbitrary amount, but it's going to set up an unnecessary barrier if we have any income test for Medicaid coverage. And I know it's going to be hard to justify this compared to what we agreed to before on COBRA, but I think when you talk about this Medicaid, you're talking about people who have lost their jobs, they're getting unemployment insurance, they may be even getting food stamps, their income and assets are going to be pretty low, and I don't think we ought to put a barrier in the way of getting them covered right away on a 2-year program under Medicaid by establishing something that would take probably years to figure out what the appropriate way would be to enforce it. So I would oppose the amendment.
Would the Chairman yield?
Yes.
As the Chairman knows, Medicaid programs now currently have an asset test in order to determine eligibility. It seems ironic that the poorest of the poor are subjected to an asset income test to get on the Medicaid rolls, but under this exclusion, we could have a millionaire who would not even be asked the question and would be able to get on the rolls with 100% federal expenditure. I just think that This is an oversight in the original
Well,
bill.
reclaiming my time, it's a theoretical issue you raise. I think it's highly unlikely that you're going to find millionaires who would like to go on Medicaid, and we're talking about people who while there may be some aberrations, they're not going to be the upper income strata, and we don't want to burden the whole system from moving forward for 2 years to cover them and let the states cover them without setting up a whole new bureaucracy for those individuals. I oppose the amendment. All time has expired. All those in favor of the Deal amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
I'd ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, ask for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Markey come in? Mr. Boyer. Rush is not here. Green. green.
Any members wish to respond to the vote that have not done so already? Clerk
On that
will
vote,
report the
Mr. Chairman, then there were 13 ayes and 27 noes.
13 ayes and 27 noes. The amendment's not agreed to.